Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Wednesday, October 23rd, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about the Democratic Party's pathway to the Senate majority in the 2024 Senate elections, amid a time where the Senate races have become increasingly more difficult for Democrats as they are defending territory in states like Montana and Ohio and West Virginia, as Republicans start to inch closer to winning some of these other battleground states. And it's very interesting to look at from the perspective of where Democrats can actually get to the magic number of 50, assuming that Vice President Kamala Harris can win the presidency. Now, 50 is a really difficult number for Democrats to reach, just, looking at it from surface level perspective. This Senate map is one of the most beneficial Senate maps we have seen for the Republican Party in a very long time. Democrats were able to hold off in some of their key Senate races in 2018, despite Republicans gaining a net 2 seats, despite the national numbers being in favor of the Democratic Party by nearly 9 points nationwide. Democrats were running up the House elections. They flipped 40 seats, and the House of Representatives flipped numerous governorships. But when it came down to the Senate races, we only saw Democrats flip Nevada and Arizona, which we would see that was foreshadowing the 2020 election results, but Republicans overall won 4 seats here in a wave that was pretty substantial for the Republican Party. But Democrats were able, again, to hold on in some of these states that Republicans arguably should have won if this was another type of election year. An election year like this one, states like West Virginia and Ohio and Montana, all states that Donald Trump won 8 points in Ohio twice, Montana by 15 points twice, West Virginia by 40 points in 2016 and 2020. The results of the 2018 Senate elections were pretty clear-cut. Partisanship was getting the better of Democrats, even popular Democrats in safe red states. And so that's becoming an ever more clear problem in the 2024 Senate elections. Senate elections that Democrats had hoped they might have been able to hold on to, assuming they had gotten everything done correctly from very early on. Now, I will admit, when we've taken a look at these Senate races overall 6 months ago, the numbers looked a lot better for Democrats. Their polling data was better, they were out fundraising Republicans in almost every single state, and the overall expected spend from the party was looking like it was coming closer to being in the battleground states rather than not. This time around, the Republican Party seems to be in a position where they are outspending Democrats in some of these key races, and were very clear that they knew the math was on their side, and you'll see that in just a moment, so they really only hyper-targeted on 2 battleground states, but now are expanding, putting Democrats on defense in some states they didn't expect to contest in as heavily. And what I mean by the math is on the Republican Party side is just taking a look at our map here. Minnesota, Virginia, going to be safe states for the Democrats, New Mexico as well here, but really unpacking where Democrats are in terms of their safe states. They're only at roughly 42. Republicans at baseline are at 38, meaning they have 38 seats that are not up for re-election. They can't be touched. They won't be touched. 38 at bare minimum. And they know they're going to do far better than that. And that's because they have races in states like Wyoming, which voted for Trump by 40 points in 2020, or Utah, which voted for Trump by 20 points in 2020, or Nebraska, which voted for Trump by 20 points, 2 elections there. Now, the special election, going to be strong for Democrats. Not Democrats, strong for Republicans. The at-large election, we'll talk about. Much more competitive than Republicans would have liked, but still have a Senate race there that Republicans can rely on. Missouri thrown into the fray. Indiana thrown into the fray. Tennessee, Mississippi, West Virginia. Now, here's the catch about West Virginia. There is a Democratic incumbent here, but Joe Manchin, the Democrat, has decided he's not running for re-election. As a response, the Republican governor, Jim Justice, who had actually announced he was going to run for the Senate seat, which likely pushed Joe Manchin out of the race. But Jim Justice is guaranteed that Senate race here. So he's going to win by 30, 40 points. It's going to be a solid Republican pickup, giving Republicans 46, and the first pickup of the evening, which would be West Virginia, which would be by a massive margin. And continuing on, let's go ahead and just take a look at where we are on our map here. So far, we're looking in states. North Dakota, I should have characterized Democrats at 42, Republicans at 47. Now, I'm going to start off by talking about Nebraska because I really just want to say this is not an election prediction. What we're doing here is mapping the pathway to the Democrats' majority. What we know about Dan Osborne, the independent running in Nebraska, he has now, I also appreciate all of you guys who corrected me in the last video. He has said publicly that he will not be caucusing with either side of the aisle. He'll reject the committee assignments. He'll reject all of these things that are necessary in terms of partisan efforts in the Senate, and he will he will legislate as an independent. And so Nebraska is a state that, in the last prediction, we said this state was likely red. I think based on margin, we're going to see it roughly likely red, so we're going to keep some of these characterizations. But again, talking about Nebraska, it's really, really interesting. We'll talk about it in a future video as we get closer to the election. Overall, though, some fascinating stuff out of there. Democrats are likely going to win Maryland, so they're likely going to do well across some of these states. When I'm just using my old prediction to baseline all of these numbers here. But here's the thing. As we go through this map here, we have to ask, what is the pathway for Republicans and Democrats in the Senate map here, given where they are in some of these states currently? So Democrats were in the tilt advantage on my most recent prediction, Republicans in the advantage in Montana and Texas. And now looking at the 2018 map, the answer would have very obviously been the map goes through Montana and Ohio. Two states that the Republican Party from very early on had recognized were the best states for the GOP and arguably where most of the money will be spent and where the most competitive races will be. And for a while it made sense. In Ohio in 2018, Sherrod Brown won by 6 points. In Montana in 2018, Jon Tester won by 3 points. But neither of these races were running alongside a presidential election, and they benefited from that. The national environment was about 6 points to the left of what it was in 2016, and if you were to just shift those states here, Republicans would have won Montana and Republicans would have won Ohio. And so when you're arguing under that pretense that in a presidential election year, these states would be red, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party knew that these would be the states where they were going to go tit for tat across the battlegrounds. And again, keep in mind, Democrats to win the Senate majority would be nearly relying entirely on a Kamala Harris victory, bringing them to 50-50, which just so happens to be, by coincidence, the same exact majority the Democrats had in 2020, with Kamala Harris actually breaking that tie. In this case, it would be then Vice President Tim Walz. And so 51-49, Montana, Texas, Florida, these are the states that really come into contention because they are the most competitive. Now, this is relying on Democrats winning in Ohio. It's relying on them winning in Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin and Arizona, Nevada and Maryland, all states that are competitive this Senate cycle. But then, to reach that 50 number, they need to know where to look. Well, Ohio is already there, so where do they go from here? Florida, Texas, or Montana? Like I said, history would have screamed Montana, but modern day understanding of the electoral dynamic in these states tells us it's Texas, not Florida, which recently had a Democratic senator in this exact Senate race seat in 2019, not Montana, which has a Democratic incumbent running for re-election, but Texas, a 3-term, going on his 3rd term if he wins, Republican Senator Ted Cruz, who has made a name for himself across the state, has gotten really big on the Republican side nationally, but so uniquely dislikable that Democrats have a serious fighting chance in the state. And a big part of why I know there is a massive fighting chance here for Democrats is just taking a look at the same data that Republicans love to elevate as a means of expanding on Donald Trump's supposed lead across many of these states. And I don't say supposed because he's not leading. I say supposed because this is the argument they build up. Donald Trump is dominating and so are we. But when you take a look at some of these numbers, it really doesn't tell that story. We saw today that a lot of Republican press picked up this Emerson College poll, which showed Donald Trump expanding on where he was before. On September 6th, he held a 4-point lead in Texas. September 27th, it expanded to a 5-point lead. Today, he's expanded to a 7-point lead. And so you can see it's pretty clear here, and you're starting to see this in some of the other polls, that according to The Hill and Emerson College, you're starting to see an advantage point for Donald Trump really gain. Kamala Harris hitting her limit at 46% kind of makes sense too. That's largely where Biden was back in 2020, but those undecideds broke for the GOP. But in this same poll, and keep in mind, it's a 7-point Republican electorate on the presidential level. So expanding 2 points to the right of 2020, an expansion for Donald Trump compared to September and early September. Good numbers for the Republican ticket nationally, but on the statewide level, not so much. What do they find? That in the U.S. Senate election, 48% of Texas voters support Ted Cruz, and 47% support Colin Allred, a U.S. representative. That is pretty important in this state. They find here that independent voters break for Colin Allred 47-42, while the same voters break for Trump 49-47. There clearly are Trump Allred voters in this election, and that matters in a race as contentious as this one. And it also isn't the first poll telling us that Texas is competitive. It has been competitive for quite some time, but the question is how competitive is it actually? Because when you're taking a look at Texas here, the average shows Ted Cruz up by 3 points. When you're taking a look at Montana, the average shows Tim Sheehy, the Republican, up by 5. And that matters. When you're looking at Florida, we're seeing that Rick Scott, the Republican, is up by roughly 5 points. That matters in analyzing a race. The data points that we have come to know may not be 100% accurate, but do tell us the direction of how some of these states are going. And the direction for Democrats have gotten a lot better in Montana, a state that, Texas, a state that earlier on had initially given Republicans a much more massive advantage against Colin Allred. That first set of polls released in December of 2023, Cruz led by 16. Then it came into a question of name ID, and people weren't really picking candidates because they didn't have an answer. I mean, stuff like this really doesn't make sense. 41-41, Ted Cruz has been in the Senate for 12 years. Everybody knows who he is, and yet somehow 18% of people haven't heard of him or are undecided on this race. Really doesn't make sense. But then when people start to become more cognizant about the state of the race, there you have it. Cruz plus 10, Cruz plus 13, Cruz plus 5, Cruz plus 9, Cruz plus 6. And then it narrows, it narrows, it narrows, it narrows. And then we got that shock poll from the Morning Consult in September, which came alongside the same time that Emerson College said Ted Cruz led by 4. The same poll that showed Kamala Harris doing 2 points better than she is today should Colin Howard losing by 4. So the direction here in terms of what we've seen for Democrats, the presidential race has not been great for Democrats in Texas, but the Senate race has been a lot better. And so from here, and what you can see is that moving forward, we are likely going to see a very contentious race, and the pathway for Democrats, I would say, rejects Montana, rejects Florida, but goes right through the state of Texas. And maybe Democrats know this, right? Obviously, a Democratic presidency wants a Democratic Senate. And what did we find out yesterday? That Kamala Harris was going to be campaigning in Texas. The first campaign rally this close to an election from a Democratic ticket since 30 years ago. Democrats have not invested in Texas the same way. This is the first time also national Democrats and the Democratic Party is giving money for the Senate race in Texas, any statewide race investments here, the first one since 2002. This is massive for the Democratic Party, and if it is to happen, if the majority is to come for Democrats, which right now it's not the likeliest outcome, but if the majority is to come, it would go right through Texas. And this, I think, would break the Republican Party, if I'm being quite honest with you. Texas has been their rock, has been their California, their massive state to combat the massive performance for Democrats in states like California. Now, granted, Texas might become that toss-up in the way Florida was, and Republicans might get Florida. And maybe that's a trade-off they're willing to do. But Texas has 40 electoral votes, and Florida has 30. California has 54, Texas has 40, Republicans get 30 out of California. Seems like they're getting the short end of the stick. Now, I'm not going to argue back and forth about whether or not these states at all will be competitive in the future. I think it's very obvious Texas is going to continue to be competitive moving forward. I think Florida might not be, but some people really leave this up in the air. I think this election will hopefully solidify some trend points here so we can pinpoint, hey, in 26, we likely should see this, rather than these races are weird and sometimes swing back and forth. But Texas, I think, has been very clear with us over the past 3 weeks and over the past month. Since that strong debate performance for Colin Allred, and since his increased name ID has gotten across the state, Allred's numbers have gotten much better. Again, that same poll that showed Donald Trump up 5 points in Texas, and then he improves by 2, but by the next poll, Cruz loses 3%. You can't ignore these things. You can't ignore the fact that Morning Consult has given Colin Allred a lead by 1 point for the first time for any Democrat in Texas in a very long time. And you can't ignore the fact that in 2018, the last time Ted Cruz was on the ballot, he was supposed to win by 7 points on the average, and guess what happened? Not only did he not win by 7 points, but he ended up actually winning by 2.6%. So a massive, massive reduction, which means if Ted Cruz is winning by 3 today, according to FiveThirtyEight, he might actually lose that election, which is shocking. Shocking, shocking, shocking. And while I don't think we're in a position where, he is going to lose the Senate race in Texas, I still think Ted Cruz will win. It is undeniable that the Democratic Party's pathway to the majority no longer lies in Montana, no longer lies on Florida, but lies in the state of Texas. And I don't think they're going to get it out of Nebraska. I don't think Democrats are going to convince Dan Osborne to caucus with the Democratic Party. I do think he's going to be true to his word when he says he will be an independent, not take committee assignments, not caucus with the party, not be put in a good desk on the Senate floor. These are things that other senators care about because they are elected by a party. And again, this is assuming that Kamala Harris wins the presidency, because Democrats are going to need a lot more than Texas if they want to win the Senate majority without Kamala Harris being president. But as of right now, Texas is that state that can hand Democrats that additional Senate race necessary to win the Senate elections, to win the Senate majority. There's a lot of pieces to this puzzle that will be required, though, for this to become reality. Like I said, the Harris victory, and also monumental shifts amongst turnout and also key constituencies in Texas to get him over that hurdle of that 1 or 2 point, loss that he's currently expected to have, according to all the data that we have on hand. Is it possible? Absolutely. Is it likely? Probably not. But it is clear, and it will likely be clear for years to come in the influence and importance of Texas, that it will be the piece of the puzzle necessary in some cases for Democrats to do well nationwide. And the moment that Democrats start investing in it very heavily, I'm sure Republicans will also do the same thing. But Texas is no longer this reliably Republican state. And that matters a lot for the GOP that used to rely on it time and time again. 50-50 would be the magic number for Democrats should Kamala Harris win the election. And they get that through the battleground state of Texas and a Senator, Colin Allred. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.